Welcome to Come Follow Me for Doctrine and Covenants sections 89 through 92. From this graph, you can see that we're dealing with the beginning part of 1833, going from the end of February to the beginning of May, where we receive these particular sections, and they're all received in Kirkland. Like many revelations in the early church, the Doctrine and Covenants, particular section 89, which we now know as the Word of Wisdom, came in response to a problem. I think most people are familiar with this particular story. Many men in the church were called to preach in various parts of the United States, and to help them prepare for this, because most of them were recent converts, well, actually all of them were recent converts, Joseph Smith started a training school, which I guess you could almost interpret as the first MTC, and it was called the School of the Prophets, and was opened in Kirkland above the Newell K. Whitney store in January of 1833. So every morning after breakfast, the men gathered to hear instructions from Joseph Smith. The room was very small, and they packed in about 25 elders. The first thing they did after sitting down was light a pipe and begin to talk about the great things of the kingdom, and then puff away. Brigham Young recounted that the clouds of smoke were so thick that men could hardly even see Joseph through the haze. Once the pipes were smoked out, they would then put in a chew on one side or perhaps on both sides, and then it was all over the floor. In this dingy setting, Joseph Smith attempted to teach the men how they and their converts should become holy, without spot, and worthy of the presence of God. You have to imagine that that had to be a very distressful moment. As we look at section 89, we understand that it was given not by commandment or constraint, but as a principle with a promise. However, in 1913, President Joseph F. Smith, in a conference report, said, "If the word of wisdom had been given as a commandment, it would have brought every man addicted to the use of these noxious things under condemnation. So the Lord was merciful and gave them a chance to overcome before he brought them under the law." I was listening to one particular speaker this week who referred to this as the spandex principle, that the Lord allows us to fit comfortably into the commandments that he gave us. We need to understand a little bit from a historical context how this went. Throughout the early history of the church, leaders invited the saints to more fully live the word of wisdom. In 1851, Brigham Young proposed that all saints formally covenant to abstain from tea, coffee, tobacco, and whiskey. You have to understand that at this time, it was difficult to find good water to drink. And a lot of people were getting sick just because of the water. Other types of alcoholic drinks that we don't partake of today were accepted, but the hard stuff, in particular whiskey, was to be abstained from. In 1882, the Lord revealed to President John Taylor that the word of wisdom was to be considered a commandment. So 50 years later, it's upgraded from a suggestion to a commandment. And then in 1919, the first presidency under President Heber J. Grant made the observance of the word of wisdom a requirement for receiving a temple recommend. So the Lord took almost 100 years to phase in this particular commandment so that the whole church wouldn't be brought under condemnation. In 1983, President Benson, in a conference address, said this: "The Lord foresaw the situation of today when motives for money would cause men to conspire to entice others to take noxious substance into their bodies. Advertisements which promote beer, wine, liquors, coffee, tobacco, and other harmful substances are examples of what the Lord foresaw. But the most pernicious example of an evil conspiracy in our time is those who induce young people into the use of drugs." The word of wisdom was introduced in section 89, almost 200 years ago, but really it was for us. As you look around the world today, you can see that evil men are conspiring to addict us to these substances that are harmful, and they're doing it for money. A British novelist named Frances Trollope reported in 1832 that in her travels across the United States, she hardly ever met a man who was not either a tobacco chewer or a whiskey drinker. Again, water, good, clean water, was almost impossible to find. The American Revolution increased their reliance on alcohol. When the British cut off their imports of things like molasses, which they used to create rum, they looked for a substitute. So the grain farmers in western Pennsylvania and Tennessee found it cheaper to manufacture whiskey than to ship and to sell the grain. As a result, the number of distilleries grew rapidly after 1780, and then boosted by settlements of the Corn Belt in Kentucky and Ohio that were distant from the eastern markets, people began to drink whiskey daily. American consumption of distilled spirits climbed sharply from 2.5 gallons per person per year in 1790 to 7 gallons per person per year in 1830, which is the highest level in American history, a figure which is 3 times today's consumption rate. That doesn't include beer or cider, that's just hard liquor. This elevated alcohol consumption offended many religious people. Alcohol was no longer viewed as a gift from God, but more as a dangerous temptation. The idea of abstinence from alcoholic beverages became a central plank of the American Temperance Society, which began in 1826. Members of the organization were encouraged to sign a pledge, and a capital T was written beside the names of those who did so. And this is where we get the word teetotaler from. By the mid-1830s, the American Temperance Society had grown to well over 1 million members. When the Saints arrived in Kirkland, there was already a temperance society there, as there were in many, many small towns. Because alcoholic reform was often discussed, the Saints really needed a way of understanding what they should do. And so the word of wisdom was introduced at a very opportune time. In the word of wisdom, you see the term strong drink, which certainly included distilled spirits, such as whiskey, which most Latter-day Saints thereafter basically shunned. But there was a more moderate approach to milder alcoholic beverages, like beer and pure wine of the grape of the vine of your own make. So for the next few generations, Latter-day Saint leaders taught the word of wisdom as a commandment of God, but they tolerated a variety of viewpoints on how strictly they observed the commandment. This incubation period gave the saints time to develop their own tradition of abstinence. Now let's move on to the area of tobacco. So this episode in the Whitney store occurred in the middle of a massive transformation within the Western culture. Tobacco spitting shifted from being a publicly accepted practice among most of the segments of the population to become seen as a filthy habit. In the midst of this cultural shift, the word of wisdom arrived. The scene that we described earlier about the smoke and the tobacco chewing in the school of the prophets would have given a non-tobacco user like Joseph cause for concern. The Smiths lived in the Whitney store, and this task of scrubbing the spittle from the hardwood floor would have fallen upon Emma and Sister Whitney. She may have complained about being asked to perform this thankless task, but there was also more practical consideration. She couldn't make the floor look decent. Brigham Young recalled the stains were impossible to get out. The whole situation seemed less than ideal for those who were called of God, as these elders were, especially when you remember that this room with the filthy floor was Joseph's translation room, the same place where he received revelations in the name of God. And so Joseph inquired and received section 89, that tobacco is not for man, but is for bruises and all sick cattle, to be used with judgment and skill. So let's move on now to hot drinks. The Americans' temperance reformers succeeded in 1830s in identifying a substitute for alcohol as being coffee. It was considered un-American to drink tea, especially after the Revolution. So that kind of opened a way for some other rival stimulant to emerge. In 1830, the reformers persuaded the Congress to remove the import duty on coffee. And so coffee fell to 10 cents a pound, making a cup of coffee the same price as a cup of whiskey. And so then whiskey began to decline. But coffee, by 1833, coffee had entered into the daily consumption of almost every family, whether you were rich or poor. The word of wisdom, however, rejected the idea of substituting coffee for alcohol. And it was said that hot drinks, which they later understood to mean coffee and tea, are not for the body or the belly. The prophet Joseph Smith and Hiram were reported to have specifically identified coffee and tea as the hot drinks mentioned in the word of wisdom. And then later, President Brigham Young confirmed this explanation. As I was doing some history on this, I found the article where Hiram made this statement in the Times and Season in June of 1842. And if you look at this highlighted area, it says, and again, hot drinks are not for the body or belly. There are many who wonder what this can mean, whether it refers to tea or coffee or not. I say it does refer to tea and coffee. And so later on, then you see that Brigham Young confirmed this. Another interesting controversy, or at least the history of it, has to do with whether or not we should drink cola drinks. This is a long-standing controversy in the church, more than 100 years old. And it was started basically in March of 1918 due to an Improvement Era article that was written by Dr. Frederick Pack, in which he discusses the word of wisdom and Coca-Cola. The original recipe for Coca-Cola actually contained cocaine. It was invented in 1885 by John Pemberton, a pharmacist from Atlanta, Georgia. When Coca-Cola was invented, cocaine was considered legal and a common ingredient in many medicines. People thought it was safe to use in small amounts, and so it was included in Coca-Cola. In fact, cocaine was not finally eliminated from Coca-Cola until 1929, but they did it gradually over many decades. So when Dr. Pack suggested that Coca-Cola should be part of the word of wisdom, it began this controversy. In 1950, the president of BYU decided that you would no longer be able to purchase any kind of cola drink on the BYU campus. However, if you follow the controversy further, there was a priesthood bulletin that was issued in 1972 by the first presidency that said, with reference to cola drinks, the church has never officially taken a position on this matter, but leaders of the church have advised, and we do now specifically advise against the use of any drink containing harmful habit-forming drugs under circumstances that will result in acquiring the habit. Any beverage that contains ingredients harmful to the body should be avoided. It wasn't until 2017 that you were able to buy cola drinks on the BYU campus. So you can see it's been a controversy for 100 years. But you'll never be asked if you drink a cola drinks when you get your temple recommend interview. So what we find from the word of wisdom is that this revelation encouraged the consumption of basic staples that has sustained life for millennia. A lot of us focus on the don'ts, but there are a substantial amount of do's, things that we should be eating. In keeping with earlier revelation endorsing the eating of meat, the word of wisdom reminded the saints that the flesh of beasts and fowls was given for the use of man with thanksgiving, but added the caution that meat was to be used sparingly and not to excess. And then also, if you read further on, it talks about the fact that it should be used in times of famine and or winter. Now you have to remember that there was no refrigeration during this time. And so it was difficult for people to keep meat fresh. There are a lot of instances historically where people were sick because they ate tainted meat. So that gives you a little bit of a historical context of why it was included in the word of wisdom. Soon after receiving the word of wisdom, Joseph Smith appeared before the elders of the school of prophets and read the revelation to him. The brethren did not have to be told what the words meant. They immediately threw their tobacco pipes into the fire. I did read another account where it said that several of the members of the school of the prophets were so addicted to tobacco that they actually went out the next day after throwing their pipes into the fire and bought new pipes. On March 8, 1833, the Lord gave another revelation, which is recorded in section 90. This revelation contains instructions on the presidency of the high priest and was a continuing step in the development of the first presidency. In fact, Joseph Smith began thinking about what would happen if he died, what would happen to the church. Ever since the year before, almost exactly a year before, he was tarred and feathered. And so this had been on the prophet's mind, I think, for more than a year. You have to remember that this time, 1833, is a full 2 years before the Quorum of the 12 would be selected. And I think he was worried about if he was killed, what would happen to the church? In particular, what would happen to the keys? And so this section 90, I think, helped pacify his mind somewhat. In 1830, April, the prophet Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were sustained as first and second elder of the church. At that time, the Lord did not implement the organizational structure of the church that we have today. In March of 1832, Joseph Smith called Jesse Gauss and Sidney Rigdon to serve as counselors in the presidency of the high priesthood. Jesse did not remain faithful, however, and the Lord then called Frederick G. Williams to take his place. On March 8, 1833, the Lord clarified that Sidney and Frederick G. Williams were to be equal with the church in holding the keys of this last kingdom. They were subsequently ordained as counselors in the presidency of the high priesthood on March 18, 1833. Then in 1835, the presidency of the high priesthood became known as the first presidency. From President Gordon B. Hinckley in April 1981 General Conference, we find the following. That same authority which Joseph held, those same keys and powers which were the very essence of his divinely given right to preside, were by him conferred upon the 12 apostles, with Brigham Young at their head, and every president of the church since then has come to that most high and sacred office out of the council of the 12. Each of these men has been blessed with the spirit and power of revelation from on high. There has been an unbroken chain from Joseph Smith to the current prophet. From Elder Widsoe, we have this particular statement. The preeminence of the president of the church was maintained. The question as to whether counselors held the same power as the president was soon debated among the people. What could the counselors do without the direct appointment from the president? These questions were answered in a meeting on January 16th, 1836. The prophet there said, "The 12 are not subject to any other than the first presidency, and where I am not, there is no first presidency." In other words, were the president taken, the counselors would have no authority. The counselors do not possess the power of the president and cannot act in the church matters without direction and consent of the president. You'll see that now even today. If the prophet dies, the first presidency is dissolved, and the apostles that formed part of the first presidency are then reinserted back in their position in the quorum of the 12 according to their seniority. I wanted to point out something in particular that happens later on in section 90 that talks about a specific woman named Vienna Jacques or Jacques, depending on whether you have a French accent or not, and what happened to her. In this particular revelation, she is mentioned by name. And then because she has consecrated her money, then she is given a place, an inheritance in the land of Zion. And she's promised some specific blessings. And so I thought we might take a little bit of a historical dive into who she was and why that happened. So she was born in 1787. She met the missionaries in Boston. She traveled to Kirkland in 1831. She stayed there 6 weeks and was baptized after meeting Joseph Smith. Upon returning to Boston, she was very active in missionary work, helping to bring several members of her family into the church and helping them establish a branch at the church in Boston. She then settled up all of her business and went to Kirkland and united her interests forever with the church. In 1833, she donated a substantial sum, and my investigations determined that she had been a nurse all of her life and that she had saved $1,200, which was an amazing amount for a single woman to have saved at that time. This was just at a time when the church desperately needed money to purchase land in Kirkland for the building of the temple and land in Missouri. She donated all of her money and received an inheritance in Zion. She traveled to Missouri. So soon after arriving there, the persecution was so intense, the saints were forced to leave. Then in June 1834, when the Company of Zion's camp was stricken with cholera, she was among those who helped attend the sick. Heber C. Kimball wrote, "I received great kindness from them, and also from Sister Vienna Jacques, who administered to my wants and also to my brethren. May the Lord reward them for their kindness." With the other saints in Missouri, Sister Jacques was driven from her home in Nauvoo as well. She eventually traveled west to Utah in 1847 at the age of 60, drove her own wagon across the plains. She settled in Salt Lake City for the rest of her life, worked hard to support herself, and diligently studied the scriptures. She died in 1884 at the age of 96. One remembrance written about her stated, "She was true to her covenants and esteemed the restoration of the gospel as a priceless treasure." It's very interesting that she appears in church history at some very memorable times. We've already talked about the fact that she appeared just at a time when the Lord needed people with money to help in building the temples. She also was there when they were kicked out of Missouri and where the printing press was destroyed, and she assisted in gathering up some of the printed sheets for the Book of Commandments. We know the famous story about the two girls that were in the cornfield, but she was right out front when they were tarring and feathering Bishop Partridge, gathering in front of everybody the loose sheets, as many as she could. She was also present when baptisms for the dead were announced and when people rushed out to be baptized for their ancestors. She was there on horseback. She was a very unconventional woman. She was out on horseback and she witnessed the first baptism for the dead. This is depicted in this particular painting. It says Anthony Sweet, but it's actually Anthony Sweat. Let's look at section 91. Historically, Joseph at this time was engaged in the translation of the Old Testament, And then he came to a part in the Old Testament that's called the Apocrypha. And so I thought I'd spend a few minutes and do a little bit of a dive into the Apocrypha, because that will show you how much of a nerd I really am. And if you know your Old Testament, then you're aware that it was written in Hebrew and that it pretty much ends about 400 years BC. But what happens is 70 years later, in 330 BC, Alexander the Great sweeps through this whole area of the known world and turns everybody to the Greek language and to the Greek customs. As time goes on, between the time of Alexander and the time of Christ, you have many of the Jewish people unable to read Hebrew anymore. The language of the day was Aramaic, but their scriptures were written in Hebrew. And then many Jews, the vast majority of Jewish people who were dispersed throughout the world, spoke Greek. And so there was a translation, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that we call the Septuagint. And included in the Septuagint were many other Jewish and Greek books that were from this intertestament time, from the time of 400 BC, when the Hebrew Bible closes, all the way up until the time when Christ arrives. And I do have a copy of the Septuagint here. And you can see here, this is the Septuagint with the Apocrypha. This one happens to be in both Greek and in English. I know it's all Greek to you guys, but some people can read the Greek. But for the rest of us, there's the English on the side to help. You can see here that the Apocrypha includes these 14 books that talk about some history, some stories, some interesting stories, some really weird stories, some fun stories like Bell and the Dragon. If you want to, you can look up on the internet and find that. So after the time of Christ, what happened was the Hebrew Bible was locked down to be only the books that were written in Hebrew. Whereas 200 or 300 years later, the Protestant Bible, or the Bible that we use mostly today, contained the Hebrew, the Greek New Testament, and then also some Greek Apocrypha, these intertestament books. So by the time Joseph Smith is working on the new translation of the Bible, he picked up a copy of what they called the Coopertown Bible and started translating in it. And as he's going through translating it, he finds these books, these apocryphal books. And so the whole idea behind this was that Joseph Smith came to this section in his King James version of the Bible, which contained these 14 books known as the Apocrypha. And while most Bibles in Joseph Smith, they contained these books, there was a growing movement at the time that questioned their status as scriptures. Given this dispute, Joseph wanted to know if he should translate them. And so he took that question to the Lord, and then we get section 91, wherein the Lord says, there are some benefits in here. Whosoever readeth it, let him understand, for the Spirit manifesteth truth. And whosoever is enlightened by the Spirit shall obtain benefit thereof. And whosoever receiveth not the Spirit cannot be benefited. Therefore, it is not needful that it should be translated. So Joseph Smith does not go through and translate it. So in January of 1833, Frederick G. Williams is called to replace Jesse Gauss as a counselor in the presidency. Basically, Jesse disappears. He just falls off the face of the map. And we've talked about this in previous videos. Then the Lord directs in section 92 that Brother Williams become a member of the United Firm. This means that he was to join the previous 9 members of the United Firm. They were the ones who managed the literary and mercantile operations of the church. There is a interesting phrase on here, and that phrase is, you shall be a lively member in this order. And I think we'll just leave that until Wednesday to talk about further. In any case, that's basically the historical background for sections 89, 90, 91, and 92. And I look forward to our panel discussion on Thursday of this week. I'm going out of town. I'm actually going out of the country. And so I won't be able to participate on that Wednesday, but we'll be doing it on Thursday instead. And so I'm looking forward to doing that, and I will see you then.